Good afternoon. I am Dr. Linda Burton. I'm the Dean of the School of Social Welfare at the University of California, Berkeley. Thank you so much for joining us for today's talk in Berkeley Conversations, where in our series, we are currently exploring what we know and what we are learning about COVID-19. I'm going to skedaddle out of here in a few minutes so that I get a chance to observe the session and enjoy it as well. And before I do that, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Susan Stone and Dr. Joyce Dorado as they discuss practical strategies for addressing pandemic-related stress and trauma in individuals and systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. I am also really delighted to have a chance to be in conversation with you today, Joyce. I wanted to do a little bit more or give our audience a little bit more on your background. You are a psychologist and co-founder of the University of California, San Francisco Healthy Environments and Response to Trauma in Schools. You have collaborated with numerous districts across the Bay Area and beyond, to create more trauma-informed, safe, supportive, and equitable school environments. Your work has been an important foundation of the San Francisco Department of Health Trauma-Informed Systems Initiative. And in addition, I know that you are a wonderful trainer and educator, and you are a dear colleague whom I love to discuss school change processes with. I couldn't imagine having a more timely guest today. The inherent stress presented by COVID-19 offers a very unique opportunity to not only discuss your work, but also engage you in a conversation about insights we might draw from, or what we can learn from trauma-informed approaches applied to this situation. So before we begin, I want you to say a little bit more about HEARTS.
Thank you so much, Susan. And I feel so honored to be here with you and talking with you. Just a little bit about HEARTS. The mission of HEARTS is to create more safe, supportive, equitable learning and teaching environments where everyone in the school community can learn and grow and thrive. And we bring a trauma-informed lens to the expertise of educators to help them do their jobs well as they are hoping to, while staying well in the process. We're a whole school culture change approach that we take. We work really closely with school teams to attend to all of their well-being, and social justice is a really important part of our work. So we started in 2008. We've been working with San Francisco Unified School District since then, and also have worked with other school districts such as Oakland Unified and other districts too. I think an important component of what we do is we don't only attend to what's happening with students, although of course that's primary, but we also try to address burnout and secondary traumatic stress with the staff, because we know that their wellness is central. We really, and I want to say this just as also a frame for this talk, that this trauma-informed approach is really not meant to be something else for an already full plate. It's meant to be sort of the thing that helps strengthen the plate so that the other things we're doing, so in schools, positive behavior interventions and supports and such, can actually work for all kids and everyone in the school community, including those who sometimes fall through the cracks with these interventions. So we've got some promising program evaluation data. We've published this, and we found suggestions that school staff have an increase in knowledge and practice around trauma-informed practices. We've seen decreases in disciplinary office referrals and suspensions, decreases in physical aggression incidents. And so if you're interested in knowing more about HEARTS, you can check us out at hearts.ucsf.edu. So that's our program.
Great. COVID has pushed the conversation around trauma-informed, healing-centered approaches, I think, to a much wider awareness than they might have been otherwise. And especially when we think and deeply reflect on what trauma means. So let's just start with the basics. It's trauma.
Yeah, sure. So trauma, the way that we define it, and lots of experts around the country define it, is in a combination of an event, how we experience that event, and then how it affects us. So the event is an actual danger or a serious threat of harm, right? And we're actually hardwired, we experience that, we're hardwired to go into fight, flight, or freeze survival response, when we're faced with that sort of threat. And then despite our best efforts, we're helpless to escape this overwhelming stressor. So then the effect on that, our bodies and brains, is it overwhelms our brain and body's ability to cope, which causes kind of a disintegration of the parts of the brain and body that normally work well together, which we'll talk about in a second, which then leads to dysregulation. So dysregulation is when I lose capacity to modulate my internal states, my stress arousal states, my emotional states, which then leads me to not be able to control my behavior. And over time, if we don't get the healing we need, this can actually cause lasting effects. So that's the bad news. But I really want to say that there is really good news. What we do know is it's absolutely possible to heal from trauma. Trauma-impacted people are not sick or crazy or bad. We may have injuries, but those injuries absolutely can heal. And in fact, many of us here in this webinar are testimony to this, that we, if we're given the opportunity to heal, we can come out the other side wiser, stronger, more compassionate, maybe even than we were before, maybe even uniquely qualified in some way to give back to the world in a certain kind of a way. So I want to always give that message of hope, along with, just how trauma can also adversely affect us.
Can you give me a very simple account of what is happening in the brain for a lay audience, in the interest of unpacking?
Sure, absolutely. So actually a general approach of our trauma-informed systems movement that I'll talk about in a second in HEARTS is that we try to take very complex concepts, research, and boil them down to the protoplasm of what anyone needs to know, regardless of who you are and what role you may have in your organization, so that we can do everything we can to do things that help heal, as opposed to things that accidentally harm, right? So I find that understanding, and educators find that we work with, find that understanding what's happening under the hood can help us not take certain behaviors personally, and instead sort of help us have a more compassionate, effective response. So a little sort of very basic neuroscience. So neurons that fire together, wire together. Neurons that fire together, wire together. Our brains and bodies are made up of, a really lot of neural networks. And these are neurons, right? And every time I do say or think something, these neurons fire together. And every time that happens, that they fire together, this connection between these neurons and through this neural network gets stronger and stronger until this becomes automatic. It's why practice makes perfect. The thing we do over and over and over again becomes automatic. It's why difficult habits are difficult, bad habits, if you will, are difficult to break, because we got to have new sort of neural connections. And so that's how that works. So that's all good and fine. It's how we learn, right? All of us. But here's the problem. If what's happening over and over and over in my brain is fight, flight, or freeze, fight, flight, or freeze, because I'm under sort of chronic threat, that wiring gets wired up really strongly. And so, put super simplistically, it's almost like trauma wears a groove in the brain, or like a rut that we're much more easily knocked into, even when we're not actually under threat. It's like an overactive alarm system, like that has a hair trigger, right? And so just if you want to have a sense of like what's happening inside the brain when I get triggered into that survival response, we all have actually a model of the brain in our hand. And so Dan Siegel does this and Second Step does this. But if you sort of, you could, those in the audience can even do this with me now. This part of our hand is like the brain stem, okay? This is the limbic region that also contains the amygdala, that's the fear center, the alarm center, if you will. And this part of our brain is the survival brain. I want you to think about this. There's a metaphor we use of a rider and a horse, okay? So think about this as the horse, okay? It acts on protective instincts. It's very strong, it's very fast. Okay, then we fold over these fingers. This lines up like this. This is behind our forehead here. This is the prefrontal cortex. This is our thinking and learning brain, right? And we need this to be activated in order to learn and to think clearly. This is the rider. Okay, so rider and horse. Now, when we have this all integrated, I want you to just wiggle your thumb if you're in the audience. And that's you having a feeling. And if your frontal lobe is nicely integrated, then I can modulate that feeling and I can express my feelings in a way that's helpful. But what happens, what brain researchers found is that when people are triggered, even if they aren't actually in danger, is that we flip our lid, the rider falls off the horse, right? And then this part of the brain takes over. This part of the brain that's like the terrified nonverbal creature that's bent on survival. And we lose access to the skills and knowledge that we normally have. And that's what can be happening when people get dysregulated and triggered. We can't do our jobs. We can't think clearly, right?
I love it when you do those beautiful. I think they're really useful. So thank you for packing a textbook's worth of brain science into a fist. Can you give me insight into what this looks like, sounds like, or feels like in a person?
Sure, absolutely. So I'll take the example of schools because that's where we work most, although this, of course, can apply anywhere, right? So in schools, what you might see on the surface is that a student's kind of doing fine, and then suddenly they don't seem to be paying attention, or they're having trouble staying on task and focusing, or maybe they seem like they're ignoring the teacher's directives, right? Or on the more extreme end of this, maybe they're even behaving aggressively, about to throw a chair or something, or they're running out of the classroom. So if we scratch under the surface, that's what's on the surface, right? And that behavior actually can get students in trouble, yeah? But if we scratch under the surface, what might be happening in this student's life, for example, is that in their home, say, maybe when grown-ups get angry, things get really scary and people are actually getting hurt. And so the student has at home developed these sort of adaptive behaviors of flight or freezing or fighting even. But when you take that out of the context of trauma and you plop it into a classroom, what's happening is maybe that the student is getting triggered by some things in the classroom that might not seem like threats to other people, like a loud noise, or somebody accidentally bumping them, or feeling some tension in the room from classmates or the teacher. And then so the dysregulated student's behavior instead gets misinterpreted, right, as oppositional. And so then the trick becomes, how do we recognize when this dysregulated behavior occurs, this as rider off the horse, fear-based behavior. Mm-hmm. So right when we see a person as afraid instead of rude or crazy, it helps us respond to the underlying fear. It actually helps us have a more compassionate response instead of a punitive response. Yeah.
Great. So, given that basic background on trauma and stress, I'd like you to try to apply some of these understandings to the current context of COVID.
Okay. So here we are in this pandemic. We're all experiencing a collective trauma that's happening here and now. So it's normal to feel scared. It's normal to feel frustrated, to feel grief. And it's really important for us to honor and acknowledge and accept these feelings. The struggle is real, all right? You know, it's also true that we're nearly 2 months into this since our daily lives have started to be affected, which is 5 weeks since the stay-at-home order began. At this stage in the pandemic, there's been a kind of a long-term wear and tear over in our bodies and brains from this sort of looming threat and for many of us, the actual danger. It's like having an IV drip of stress, right? On top of already existing things that stress us out. So things like cognitive fog, irritability might even be setting in. You might notice that. So here's what we know. What we know is that when we're subjected to long-term, chronic, unceasing stress that builds and builds, it can cause wear and tear on our brains and bodies. It can weaken our immune system. It can make it hard for us to think clearly. And it can even, if we don't address it, can start to sensitize our brains such that our riders are more easily knocked off our horses, just like I talked about, even by a mild stressor that's not actually dangerous. So what can we do about this? What we can do is make sure that we're taking breaks during our day, our busy days with work and our kids if we have them, so that our brains and bodies can recover. And that prevents that sort of acute and chronic stress buildup. So we have stress, can I pause and recover? And that sort of helps me metabolize those stress neurochemicals. So I can take quick physiological breaks, like I just kind of did it naturally just now. So a nice deep breath in. Let's actually do this right now. In through the nose. And a long, slow exhale through the mouth. We want our exhale to be longer than our inhale. I feel better already. Physiological things like stretching or standing or moving, right? And from the Greater Good Science Center, we actually know that even if we give ourselves small bursts of happiness through connection, through looking at a funny cartoon, we'll talk a lot more about that later. This can all help us metabolize those stress neurochemicals and calm us down so we can recover. And there's one more thing I wanted to say about this before we go to the next question. Some people worry like, oh no, stress is bad. Well, I just want to say that stress is not actually bad in and of itself. Actually, some level of stress anxiety is really good for us. So in the case of the pandemic, if we don't have enough stress anxiety, we could actually maybe be too lax in our behavior and act kind of irresponsibly, right? If we have too much stress and we go into panic, like this can actually make us do harmful things like panic buying or yelling at our kids to do this or that, right? If we have an optimal level of stress anxiety, it actually helps us to meet the challenge, right? It actually oxygenates our brain and does all sorts of really good things for us. So the trick is to get us to this place where I've got the energy, but I'm not in panic. I think I want to sort of keep going with this. Do you feel like that's okay?
Sure. Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
So great. So what we know is that what we pay attention to, even especially if we're not in imminent danger, can actually affect how our body responds to it, right? So one thing to know is that when we're under extreme stress, we tend to overestimate and our brains glom onto all of the bad stuff. And then we tend to underestimate the resources that we have available to us, internal and external, to cope with this. So knowing this can actually help counteract this. So my suggestion to folks might be, decrease your exposure to bad news. Maybe limit how often you check the news to at the most 2 times a day, and be really mindful about when you do that. Try not to do it right before you're trying to go to sleep, or if you have small children, when they're watching. And then we want to make sure that we increase our exposure to things that give us hope. So knowing that our efforts of physical distancing are actually helping to flatten the curve here in the Bay Area, and even holding in our minds, that we in generations past have been through really tough times. I'm here because my parents survived occupation and World War II in the Philippines. What has gotten my people through? We know that we can get through this together, and try to focus your brain on that.
I want to stop you there, Joyce. So far, you've focused on what individuals basically can do to cope with, basically cope with stress response. Are you suggesting that this is completely a mind over matter thing? And that we can, deep breathe everything away?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that, Susan. I really do want to say these strategies aren't going to make these incredibly difficult things go away. They're not even going to make stress go away. But these ideas that we're going to talk about today might just help us cope better with what's happening, so that we can prevent long-term difficulties that unaddressed stress and trauma can cause. Right. So that's really what it's about.
I really appreciate this overview. And now that you've talked through stress, traumatic stress, and some strategies for mitigating stress response, I want to now turn us to what do we mean by a trauma-informed approach. I'm not sure our viewers know it, but it's these, you hear this a lot. Trauma-informed, trauma-sensitive. What do you mean by that exactly?
Thank you for asking that. It's really helpful to try to clarify this. So a trauma-informed approach, like at its base, takes into account the science around trauma, stress, healing, and resilience, and then applies that science to try to promote positive change for individuals and organizations. So I described that sort of neurobiology of trauma. And what we know from that is that trauma fragments our brains and our bodies. But as it turns out, because organizations are made up of living beings, individuals like you and I, when you've got a whole organization full of super stressed out folks, our organizations, it actually can fragment our organizations, right? So you might have an organization that we might call a trauma reactive organization, where there's a lack of cohesion between teams. One team's working at cross purposes with another team. There's scapegoating and finger pointing. We might have some hyperreactivity where things that aren't actually like life-threatening, people, behave as though when the copy machine goes out, it's life-threatening, and then everybody takes a hit. Sometimes people sort of shut down and just get really numb and then become, not empathic with each other. We see sometimes rigidity, where, it's all about rules and we can't be flexible and adaptive. And so those are the kinds of things you might see in a trauma reactive organization. And so the trauma-informed approach tries to address stress and trauma so that organizations can create conditions where everyone who's working within these organizations and everyone the organization serves can feel safe and supported and do their jobs well. So it's kind of like people talk about 4 R's. It's realizing the widespread impact of trauma. It's recognizing how it shows up at work and at home. It's responding by shifting our practices, and it's doing everything we can to not traumatize or re-traumatize people. So here in the Bay, I just want to mention that the trauma-informed movement, which is what I would call it, is guided by 6 principles. And those 6 principles are understanding trauma and stress, cultural humility and equity, safety and stability, compassion and dependability, collaboration and empowerment, and resilience and recovery. So if you didn't catch that, you can find those principles on traumatransformed.org and on hearts.ucsf.edu. And I just want to say that these principles are being used across the wider Bay Area and beyond, across lots and lots of different sectors. That's why I'm calling it a movement. So we just kind of talked about understanding trauma and stress just now.
Well, and I think it would be really, first of all, thank you for the use of, for pointing us to the resources. For the remainder of our time together, I think it's probably most useful if we actually walk through all of those principles systematically. Okay. And with concrete examples. In the interest of time, I think this will probably be most engaging and really enable us to think about some specific applications to COVID-19. And so what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to focus on the basics of the principles. Unlike conversations we have where we discuss all of the different integrations of a multidisciplinary set of literatures that spans psychology to education, where there's often different names for similar things and vice versa. And I think this is useful because then at least given the language differences, I think that'll give a common understanding of what these mean.
Right.
I also anticipate that those watching may have questions, so we encourage our audience to send those in. We're going to try, if we have time, to answer a question near the end. But I also wanted to take this opportunity to let our viewers know, so we will compile questions to see if there's continued interest in deepening this discussion in different conversation venues. So I guess the first thing that I couldn't help but notice is cultural humility and cultural humility and equity is the first principle. And I'd like you to tell us the second principle. Please tell us about that.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, actually, cultural humility is one of our foundational principles. And I think just to sort of set this up, I'll say that in grad school back in the day, we learned about trauma as being violence, abuse, loss, disaster. We know that this is true, right? But the fact is that these traumas actually occur in a societal context. And things like racism, xenophobia, sexism, homophobia, these are all societal oppressions that unfortunately are still alive and well and living in America. And we really see these societal oppressions as trauma inducing in and of themselves. It's that looming and sometimes quite concrete in your face threat that my safety isn't quite as important as somebody else's safety because of the lottery of birth, the color of my skin or where I was born or who I love, right? And so that's why we have this as a foundational principle.
That's a great, or making me think about how COVID-19 is especially affecting communities of color. How would you apply this principle to disproportionate impact such as that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're talking about is the really difficult thing to notice, which is that the pandemic has made much more clear the structural inequities that existed even prior to the pandemic. So while this pandemic, of course, affects everybody, people with lower incomes and fewer resources are being disproportionately affected, including job loss and insecure housing and food. And the crisis is also really shedding a very glaring light on things like existing health disparities, right? So just heartbreakingly, Black and Brown people have a much higher death rate. And this is likely because of sort of pre-existing conditions that people of color have on a disproportionate way, things like diabetes and asthma. And this may be also because of the kinds of structural inequities that exist that drive these illnesses, like decreased access to really quality healthcare, higher exposure to environmental toxins, like in Baby Hunter's Point, the chronic stressor of dealing with racism and anti-immigration sentiments, for example. We've seen a xenophobic rise in xenophobic biases against Asians and Asian Americans. And then the other thing to know is that these things already existed, but stress and anger and fear actually exacerbate our vulnerability to act on the biases that we all carry, those implicit and unconscious biases. So for a trauma-informed approach, this is why we really believe that if a policy, procedure, action is not socially just, So racially just, immigration, justice for immigrants and such. If it's not socially just, it's not trauma informed. So that's the bad news. The good news is, okay, that our diversity here in the Bay and across the country is one of our greatest strengths. And we can do something about this. We can be aware of our own implicit biases and make sure we take responsibility for counteracting them. We can take a really good hard look at institutional biases that are sort of baked into our institutions and actively work to dismantle them. And I really have a lot of hope that since these harms are becoming even more visible to us, that it can be a call to action for us to come together, right? And hold ourselves accountable as individuals and institutions and communities to speak up as individuals, for example, when we hear bigotry, to right the wrongs of these structural inequities. And I also think that we need to, as we try to address these, try to bring in the wisdom and the experience of all of our communities, and perhaps especially the ones that have traditionally been marginalized and pushed out. And that we can also support all of our communities to draw on their cultural roots, their spiritual practices. Again, what have your people done to get through the hardship that you've been through? So those are the kinds of things that this makes me think about.
Even more specifically, what can a trauma-informed approach tell us about, what we can do about stress and trauma in the context of the pandemic? She started out.
Sure. So,
say more.
Oh, yeah. So, okay, while the COVID-19 pandemic is totally unprecedented in our lifetime, we actually know a lot from a lot of research and science and experience about how we can cope with trauma and stress, right? So one of the things that science tells us is that how we interpret other people's behavior actually affects how we feel about that person, which then affects how we behave towards that person, and then affects the situation, right? So right now, a lot of us are experiencing chronic stress, right? That's leading to our riders more frequently falling off of our horses, even for small things. And so it becomes all the more important for us to all recognize that behavior like that is rider off the horse behavior and not rude behavior, right? So what we know is that challenging behavior, what it often signals is some sort of unmet need. And when someone's acting off the hook in front of you, your child, your colleague, whoever, can we just take a breath, right? Get my own rider on my horse. And instead of asking to myself, what is wrong with this person? Can I be asking, what has happened to this person? Or maybe even importantly, what's happening for this person right now? And what might be like the unmet need that I can try to meet in this instance to try to help, prevent this from blowing up. And so that might sound really super therapy-y, like, oh, we got to be a therapist to do that. But I'm here to tell you that it's actually fairly simple. So I'm going to give you 3 really good guesses as to what might be happening under the hood if something's starting to go sideways. All of us have a basic need for safety, for connection, and for a sense of agency, the idea that I can do something about my plight. And so if what I can do, if something's starting to people getting dysregulated, what can I do to help this person feel a little bit more safe? Maybe even take a deep breath with them to help them feel cared about, right? To cared for, and to help them feel like they're have a little bit more control and have some choice. Those are the kinds of things that actually we can do in general to try to mitigate the effects of stress and trauma during the pandemic.
Okay, so that was, you just gave a very high level overview of the 3 principles you mentioned: safety and stability, compassion and dependability, and collaboration and empowerment. I just thought we should just take a few minutes to really quickly run through those. So please tell me a little bit more about the importance of safety. You've alluded to it.
Right. So again, what we know from what's happening under the hood is that none of us can think clearly and access our best selves if we don't feel safe. So then it becomes super important to establish and maintain safety. And what we mean by that is physical safety, relational safety, and emotional safety.
How about stability?
So stability, what we mean by that is predictability, right? So we all do better with routines, and that sense of like, what's going to happen next can be very anxiety provoking and even triggering for some. So we try to create routines and help the environment be as predictable as possible.
So I'm just thinking here that we have, as a wider Bay Area community, received so many guidelines, public health guidelines, that really circle around physical safety. I personally have not heard as much about relational or emotional safety in the context of this pandemic. So I thought I'd ask you to riff on that.
Okay, sure. Well, so relational safety is about the feeling like somebody cares about me, somebody's got my back, right? So physical distancing, and I wish we would change the language from social distancing to physical distancing, doesn't mean losing social connection. So we don't want to spread panic. Instead, we want to spread love and compassion. So what can I do to make sure that I'm not spreading panic and traumatizing people? What can I do so that what I'm doing with other people is trauma reducing as opposed to trauma inducing? Everybody is under stress and on edge. If someone's acting off the hook in front of me, instead of going, coming back at them, can I just maybe pause and take a breath and ask if you're okay, right? So that's relational safety. We actually have much more control in some ways over relational safety than we do over physical safety out in the world, right? So emotional or internal safety, when our riders are off our horses, actually our behavior can cause harm. And especially if we've got power over someone, like if we're a boss or a parent. So the trick is then to keep our own riders on our own horses. And there's some really practical skills that we can tap into. So noticing our feelings and naming them actually changes what's happening in our brain, and it kicks us up out of that sort of survival brain and more into our thinking brain. We want to do everything we can to try not to act out of fear and panic. We can metabolize our stress neurochemicals. There's been a good tip here that, like, if you can get your heart rate up through exercise once a day at least, maybe even 20 minutes, even if you want to break it up, that can help us metabolize those stress neurochemicals. You want to protect your sleep. It's so important for us to sleep. There's a study that says that 6 days in a row of 6 hours or less of sleep actually puts our brain in the functioning of somebody who's got a 0.08 blood alcohol level. So we're not thinking clearly if we're not sleeping, right? We want to drink a lot of water, take those breaks that we talked about.
What about stability, briefly?
Yeah, so everybody's knocked off their routines, right? So what can we do to establish healthy routines that make sense within the context of COVID, and be flexible about retooling them, but do have a routine? And how do we make sure we let go of like old routines that we had pre-pandemic that don't make sense, right? So that we can have routines that can help us feel more stable.
Thank you for that. You, in the overview, you were talking about basic needs, one of which is connection. So tell me how the compassion and dependent, why is this an important principle? Or unpack that a little bit more.
Sure. So compassion and dependability, right? Relationships are we know this from all the research in lots of fields, are at the center of any intervention working. We know it in medicine, psychotherapy, business, right? We're actually hardwired to connect with each other. We have interpersonal neurobiology. If you like this kind of thing, check out Dan Siegel. We're hardwired for connection, to heal us, to help us be calm when we're stressed out, and for compassion to be such a healing thing. This is really what I want everybody, if you forget everything else, remember this, that compassion and connection and love are incredibly important to nurture in this situation. Compassion is being aware of somebody else's suffering or need, feeling emotionally moved or empathic by that, and then we have a wish to alleviate suffering. And this third component is super important. Because if we just are vibing with somebody and having that empathic resonance, but we don't have this intention to relieve, it actually activates the pain centers in our brain, and that can then cause this sort of panic contagion. But if we have the intention to try to alleviate the suffering, even just by bearing witness to what this person's suffering is, and I see you, I feel you, I get it, that actually activates the parts of our brain that are associated with pleasure and affiliation, right? So social connections can make us happier, they can make us healthier. Strong social connections give us 10 years more life expectancy. Oxytocin, that love neurochemical, is really good for our immune systems. And really what we can do is provide co-regulation for each other. So co-regulation is when I lend somebody my calm neurobiology to help them calm down. And we actually are hardwired for that to work really well.
Can I tell you that I appreciate that all the time. I find that you co-regulate me a lot in our conversations. One of the things that just seems hard in the context of the pandemic is, how do we foster that in the COVID context?
Right. So if you do have people in your household, I encourage you to get those hugs if that feels safe and good to you, because that sort of activates that oxytocin system. The fact is that in this pandemic, what's really bringing to light is that we're all connected, right? All of my health and well-being is wrapped up in yours, in the grocery checkers, in my neighbors, and we're all connected. And so how do we sort of take that into our hearts? So again, the bad news is that panic is contagious, but the good news is so is love. Love is the medicine here. We can extend our circle of caring to other people because we understand that our health is all bound up in each other. And when I'm wearing a mask, that's a compassionate act, right? My mask is protecting you. Your mask is protecting me. We can still connect with each other by phone, by video, even by text. That can help so much. We can try to practice patience with each other. We can extend grace to each other. So grace is the face that love wears when it meets imperfection. It's that forgiveness. I get it. This is hard. We're all doing the best we can. If we're a leader, we can try to be human and present and available to our staff. We can serve as a co-regulator to our staff, and then make sure we're getting lots of good co-regulation ourselves, right? So those are the kinds of things we can do.
Finally, how about, we've talked about sense of safety, and dependability, compassion, and finally, would you briefly elaborate the collaboration and empowerment principle?
Yeah, I'm going to try to be super brief here. What we know from the science is that when we feel like we have voice and choice in our work settings and other places, we're healthier, happier, and more productive. We know that having a sense of control over stressors mitigates the effects of stress on a cellular level. We know in the field of trauma that when we can do something about our plight, it actually helps us to heal better afterwards. So that's why that's an important concept.
I just want to acknowledge that COVID-19 just has this tremendous capacity to threaten individual and collective senses of sense of agency, quite frankly. So what's your thinking about that principle may apply to the pandemic?
Yeah. So I have got to remember as a parent, for example, I need to try to give my children as much choice as is possible in this pandemic. Places where I can provide them with some choice about, well, would you like to go on a walk now or in a half an hour, can help. Also, and I heard this from the Greater Good Sense, it was so helpful for me. Can we try to let go of the things that we can't control? So I can't control whether or not other people practice physical distancing. I can just move back myself. I can't predict what's going to happen in the coming months. I can't control the amount of toilet paper in the store, right? But what I can control and what I can feel empowered within are things like how I follow the CDC guidance, how I can turn off the news, how I can find soothing, fun things for my kids and I to do in my home, how can I can act kindly and compassionately towards others. And like, say hi and how are you to the checker in the grocery store, or actually wave to people as they pass by, even though people are wearing a mask. So those are the kinds of things.
So I know we have one more principle to cover. And before we end with that, I actually wanted to take this opportunity to pose a question from the audience because I think it fits well here. I think it's a good question because I think it goes to the basics of what the approach is, because it really asks us to go beyond the individual to the systematic or the systemic application of the approach, about how do we change organizational conditions. And, it goes back to what you said about hearts, for example, that it's about culture change. What we do on a daily basis and how the principles might give us guideposts towards those ends. I also want to ask this question selfishly because I think it also gives us an opportunity to briefly speak to the challenges of building knowledge around this approach. So the question is, if I can read it well, are there ways that organizational resilience can be held with the need to create structures of care during this time? It often feels like during this pandemic that organizations are focusing on production and maintaining routines rather than building ample space for the vast responses to the trauma and grief inherent to the situation. I'm paraphrasing. What room does a trauma-informed framework have for addressing holding, I guess, or creating pause and care?
Pause and care. It's such a good question. Yeah,
it is. Why don't you use an example from your work in schools to illuminate that?
Okay, great. Well, I really appreciate that question because it really highlights the need for us to pause and reflect on what's happening and how can I make this better in my own sphere of influence, and to care, right? That connection and compassion. So yeah, let me just move to kind of what we do in schools is just as an illustration of how this can help shape organizations. So at the onset in schools, we try to create common language and common understanding about how chronic stress and trauma can affect any of us as human beings, how it can affect our health and our behavior, our relationships, our interactions with each other, our work, and ultimately our organizations. And then what anyone can do, regardless of what their role is in the system. So whether you're an administrator or a teacher or the lunch lady, right? Or a parent or a student, really, what anyone can do to try to contribute towards healing, safe, supportive, equitable learning and teaching environments as opposed to accidentally causing harm. And we organize our trainings and our professional developments around 6 principles that are basically the school version of the ones we've been going about. If you want to check that out, you can look at hearts.ucsf.edu. So we use those principles in a way to sort of examine ongoing interventions or procedures as such, and encourage folks to ask themselves a systematic set of questions. How can what I do be trauma reducing instead of trauma inducing? So let me just give you an example with understanding and trauma and stress. So a principal might be asking herself during this pandemic crisis, how might trauma and stress make it difficult for my staff to engage in and to engage students in learning? It's really hard to be creative when our riders are off our horses. It's hard to be open to new things and to be able to think outside the box and do that healthy intellectual risk taking that's so important to learning, right? So when the leaders we see understand this, and they really do, that actually helps them do their jobs better. And that thing that I just said about what stress does to us, it affects staff, it affects students, it affects stressed administrators. So we really try to work with the schools to try to mitigate that. So I've had the privilege of seeing incredibly strong leadership in the schools where we work. Principals are realizing things like, okay, I've got to get my own rider on my own horse before I respond to this aggravating situation, right? So they might check in with us or with a trusted colleague so that they can get that co-regulation and have some thought partnering, that auxiliary frontal lobe to think about, okay, what can I do here? And they realize if I don't embody these principles, it's really hard for me to then support a person towards positive change. So there, in terms of, for example, creating that relational safety that we talked about, strong leaders are practicing relational leadership. They realize that connection with their staff, their ability to pause and listen carefully and address concerns, to show their concern before they challenge others to grow. This actually helps helps their teachers and staff stay well, but also creates the conditions for teachers to approach their students in the same way and centralize connection. So one of our principals read a quote from this great article in Teaching Tolerance on trauma-informed teaching. She said, relationships and well-being can take priority over assignments and behavioral compliance. Strong leaders are really focusing on trying to help everybody have a growth mindset. Okay, we're all learning and growing. We're going to make mistakes. It's okay. We're going to learn from them and move on. They're doing community building routines. Even in these Zoom meetings where they have a check-in, always at the beginning, people are checking in about things like, oh, what's getting you through? What helps you feel appreciated? At the ends of the meetings, they're doing shout outs and gratitudes. I watch this happen and see how much people care about each other, and that helps people in organizations get through. People are trying to create stability and predictability even in the midst of sort of this uncertainty. So leaders are trying to be super transparent about what's coming down the pike. They're trying to communicate what they know, what they don't know, what tensions they're up against, how they're trying to resolve those tensions. And they're trying to also embody this collaboration and empowerment when they're inviting in voice, right, from their staff about, we've got this sticky situation here. What do you think about how we can solve that? They're really trying to do everything they can to work with their school community and not just do things to them or for them. And we all know we make better decisions as leaders when we involve folks that are impacted by decisions in sort of defining the problem and coming up with the solutions. So there's a lot of really good practices that you can see on the Trauma Transformed website for leadership during COVID. And I just want to say, to close this part, that these things were true before the pandemic. There's maybe especially true during the pandemic. And we're really doing everything we can to sort of learn from this and then hold on to these best practices even after the pandemic.
So I want to just, we have about 5 to 7 minutes left. And I wanted to just take a moment to summarize what you just described. You are really emphasizing that this approach is a bit less about the what, and it's compatible with other programs, but much more about the how, the processes that a school organization cultivates to do their work together. And I also want to, I guess, be really transparent with our audience that oftentimes people hear, oh, trauma-informed approach, will this change everything overnight? And from what you're finding, no, this takes time. And that would be very consistent with other school change literature. I just want to say that I think these are some of the really interesting and generative questions. Some of the syntheses of evidence on this approach have been more equivocal, but these are also fairly complex interventions that you are getting adults in schools primarily to be different with each other. So I can just hear, I can anticipate that when I say this takes a while, people will get stressed by that. I do sometimes. Like, I wish we could just, so I'm anticipating that it's going to be hard to hear that systems change takes a while, even pre-COVID and post-COVID. And so I want you to kind of, as perhaps some final thoughts, think about how this approach addresses kind of this sustainment, staying power, hope?
Great question. So you're right. This is really hard. And here's the thing about resilience. Okay, resilience is being able to face down the sometimes brutal reality of what is, and then holding on to a staunch optimism that we can overcome it. And I really want to just encourage that during this COVID pandemic. How do we maintain hope? How do we focus and build on strengths? How do we proactively build our resilience? We can do that individually and organizationally. So we don't want to be hopeless, right? Because hopeless makes us feel paralyzed. But there's a lot of really interesting science around positive psychology. For example, things we can reach for that are science-based, that are put out by the Greater Good Science Center. So what they say over there is that we need more positive emotions in order to stay healthy, more positive emotions than negative emotions in order to stay healthy. So we can use this crisis as an opportunity to cultivate positive emotions like happiness, gratitude, awe, even forgiveness and compassion. And so check it out on greatergoodsciencecenter.org. No, greatergood.berkeley.edu. Yes. And just, I want to say that staying positive doesn't mean you have to be happy all the time. It just means that even on the hard days, you know that there are better ones coming. This comes from an Instagram post on Upworthy. But so I just want to say something about post-traumatic growth and close with this. So again, from something I saw on Instagram, which is really helping me in some ways, in the rush to return to normal, can we use this time to consider what parts of normal are worth rushing to? So everyone wants to get back to normal. I get it. I'm really hoping, though, that we can learn something from this pandemic crisis that can actually help us to grow into a healthier, happier, wiser, more equitable global community. Can we realize that in our global society, the old normal actually wasn't working for a lot of people? So instead of trying to grasp it like getting back to the old normal, can we expand towards coming to a new normal, better new days instead of just good old days? We're really learning about the crucial value of people who have been invisible to many of us, the essential workers like those who stock our grocery stores and grow our food and serve and clean. We undervalue them. How can we, now that they've become more visible to us, treat our workers with the gratitude and respect and the working conditions that they deserve? We're learning about what is actually essential. What's actually essential is access to health care and healthy food and housing. In the old normal, there was already barriers against this. How do we, in the new, better normal, try to counteract those barriers? And so really, as I just want to close with this, the fact is that we are in the middle of very challenging times. And there are certainly going to be harder times ahead, very tough times. I hope we're through some of the worst of it, but very tough times ahead. But I truly believe that if we can work together, if we can act with thoughtful intention about how we can help as opposed to accidentally harm, if we can lead with love in all of our actions, if we can reflect on what we're learning as we move through this, that we really can get through this and come out the other side stronger, wiser, more compassionate than we were before. And I just want to quote, just to really end, a poem by Laura Kelly Finucci that I've seen. It's really beautiful, and I'm just going to read it to you here. When this ends, may we find that we have become more like the people we wanted to be, that we were called to be, that we hoped to be. And may we stay that way, better for each other because of the worst. My heart, my love goes out to all of you. Thank you for everything that you're doing to try to help each other and to take good care of yourselves. Thank you, Susan, for being such a good friend and colleague and for doing this. And that's what I want to leave you with.
Well, I wanted to thank you back. I'm glad that it was really fun to illuminate how you are in real life and how you take, you pack a lot of science into really understandable principles. And we've scratched the surface here. And I want to thank our viewers like you. And just as a reminder in closing that our viewers should feel free to submit follow-up questions, and we will review them and see if there is interest in continuing this conversation going forward. Thanks a lot, Joyce.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much.